Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back to my channel, Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer with you guys. Just wanting to have a bit of a chat about the astrology for the month of July. So I'm just going to bring up this chart, which is for the 3rd of July, which is today for me. And what I'll do is I'll animate the chart and we'll just move around in order to observe the movement of the planets, changing signs, going retrograde, etc. The first thing that I want to say is that I did want to do a video, and I apologize for not doing one. I'm actually in a fair bit of pain at the moment, just with some issues I've got with my neck and my back. So it was just more comfortable for me to not do a video. And it's just a lot quicker for me to do an audio recording. So either way, I mean, you don't really have to see me. You can hear my voice and you can look at the chart. And that way you can just walk around and do dishes or do whatever you have to do while you're listening to this. I had somebody say that to me the other day about my previous audio recording, which made me laugh. I thought it was quite cute. She was doing her dishes while she was listening to my audio. It's fabulous. Okay, guys, so look, I've been reflecting very much on the upcoming transits and observing them and feeling them as well, and particularly because the month of July, I feel is quite a challenging month for us, actually. It's not easy. The energies are extremely potent because we have two eclipses. We have the solar eclipse, which is taking place as we speak. And then in the middle of the month, on the 16th of July, we have the lunar eclipse. So two eclipses in 1 month. It's pretty intense energies. Now, I have done videos on the solar and lunar eclipses, so I'll pop the links below in case you haven't seen them and you are new to my channel. But I think, when we are looking at a month that has two eclipses, there's a lot of material that gets triggered from our subconscious and unconscious components, and especially material that is hidden, which obviously if it remains in our subconscious and unconscious components, it is hidden. So eclipses have a way of, particularly a solar eclipse, it has a way of bringing this material or content that we are really out of touch with, and it brings it up to the surface, and it triggers the solar eclipse triggers this content that we are perhaps out of touch with. And basically those components relate to our shadow, as Carl Jung coined that term. We all have a shadow side. There's no one on this planet that doesn't have a shadow side. It's just that, some people are more connected to it, more aware of it, and working with it consciously. And of course, there are, other people that are very much out of touch with it. Hence, when a solar eclipse takes place and it hits off something really significant in the person's chart, usually a critical event shows up. Now, you can still have a pretty intense event show up, but if you are the sort of person who, how can I put this? If you're the sort of person that has been doing, work on themselves spiritually, right, on an evolutionary level, on a conscious level, then you are more than likely you will deal with the situation better. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you are more conscious that the eclipse won't necessarily trigger off an event. It still can do that, but it just means that you will handle it a lot better. Whereas somebody who is more unconscious, and that's not a criticism, by the way, when I say that, it's just we are all, we all have different levels of consciousness. That's just a fact. So for those that are operating perhaps more at the personality level, don't have as much consciousness, then this solar eclipse will generally trigger a pretty critical, significant event if the solar eclipse is forming a conjunction or opposition to any of your personal planets and or the 4 angles of the birth chart, being the ascendant, IC, descendant, and MC. Now, solar eclipses generally don't bring up pleasant, happy-go-lucky type of events. They really bring up challenges, okay? So again, it's just a question of how much consciousness and awareness you can bring to the situation in order to deal with it appropriately, where you are not reacting out of control, where it doesn't spin you out totally. Now, there is going to be people where this solar eclipse triggers something quite personal in their chart, and if they are really out of touch with that content, which will be defined and described by the sign the eclipse is in this case, the solar eclipse is in Cancer. So naturally, there's going to be perhaps some family ties, family connections, family issues that can be triggered, and just your own inner subjective nature in terms of how you see yourself and who you think you are, really. And then, depending on what planet is hit off, then that planet is going to add another layer again, describing what the trigger is going to be connected to, right? So if it's the sun, then it's got to do with your own personal masculinity, masculine energy. And if you're a woman and or a man for that matter, it's got to do with the men in your life as well. That also applies to Mars. If this eclipse hit Mars, it would be the same thing. It would be very much a matter of your own personal desires, which is Mars. But Mars also signifies men in the chart, men, especially for women, women who have relationships with men. Now, I want to give you a brief example. I'm not going to go into any detail because it is a personal example, and I just don't like to. I don't really like to sort of quote names or anything like that. But this solar eclipse, for instance, is opposite my Mars, okay? I have Mars in Capricorn, and it's in my 12th house. And just bear in mind that these eclipses, whilst it's today, the energy of this has been building up for quite some time. And it's kind of like what was sort of in your blind spot, as it were, sort of shows up as the energy intensifies. And it could be on the eclipse date, could be a couple of days before the actual eclipse date, or it could be post the eclipse date as well. So it's very difficult to say it's going to be on the exact eclipse date, because for some reason it doesn't necessarily work like that, because these energies don't sit in a pocket of just one day. So my Mars in the 12th house is a very complex Mars. It's exalted because it's in the sign of Capricorn. It's got wonderful aspects to it in my chart and so forth. But regardless of all the things it's got going for it, it's a very difficult Mars because it describes unconscious components about myself that relate to my own masculinity, and are tied up into men I attract, interactions I have with men, whether it's on a friendship level, professional level, or personal level. It seems to come out in all those streams for me. And the problem I've had through the years is attracting men who are not really direct, if I can just put it in a kind way. So it's been an issue of attracting dodgy kind of guys, that haven't been particularly honest, direct, and so on and so forth. I'm putting it very lightly here, and because I just don't want to unpack personal details necessarily. But I'm bringing it up because something did happen just a couple of days ago for me with a male, where this particular individual had quite a strong reaction to me. in a way that was actually quite aggressive and quite rude, and not really called for either, in my opinion. And I have spoken to someone very close to me to get their perspective, just to make sure that I'm being really objective, right? And the person who I spoke to agreed to me, said that this person was unprofessional, and his tone was not really appropriate based on the context of what happened. But anyway, regardless of what happened, what was said, and so on and so forth, it's a classic description of my Mars being eclipsed in the 12th house, where this male, who's not in my life personally, but is sort of has been somehow connected in my professional / social media sphere, if you like. And my intuition did speak to me very strongly on my first impressions, but I, for some reason, just decided to put my intuition aside and just hold a completely professional, detached sort of perspective. But what's transpired has just affirmed to me that my intuition actually was correct right from the beginning, and that I really just should have listened to that. So this can be, I'm sharing this because this can be something that you go through as well. And it can be as subtle as this, as subtle as realizing that you had a very strong intuition about something or someone. Could have been a few months ago, could have been at the start of the year. And perhaps you didn't pay attention to it. And now this eclipse, because it's eclipsed my Mars and it's got to do with men in my life, then there was a significant situation that transpired. It didn't get out of hand because I didn't actually react. I felt like reacting, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. I felt like saying a number of different things, which would have been fair on my part to react in that way. But I've realised over the years that reacting to this Mars in the 12th, when it comes at me from out there, because this is what's going to happen to a woman who has Mars in the 12th. The Mars comes at you from out there until you really learn how to integrate it into your consciousness. So this was a beautiful test from the universe for me, because if this was 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, I would have reacted quite strongly. I've got a Sun square Mars and I'm an Aries, so I don't shy away from combat or conflict or head-on head-butting debates or whatever it may be. I can take on those situations quite easily. But I've learned through the years that a lot of the times that I have reacted in those ways, it hasn't benefited me. It's just simply put me on the same sort of level as the person opposing me, and ultimately taken my energy away, taken my power away. Now, this is a very important key for Mars in the 12th. If you're a woman and you are listening, Mars in the 12th means that you need to find a way to integrate that Mars power back into your own consciousness. Because in the 12th house, it literally is floating around, not anchored into anything, and just comes back at you through the men in your life. So it can feel like masculine forces working against you. That's a very important point. And I personally have experienced that, so I know that it's 100% accurate. So if you have Mars in the 12th, and now this can apply to men as well, by the way. I know someone who's out in the public eye very strongly, who's in a similar sort of field, and this person has Mars in the 12th. He's a male, and he has a lot of enemies, this particular person. Now, there's a whole discussion that could go around that, and I'm not going to go into it, but I'm just simply saying that this can be happening to you if you're a guy or if you're a girl. The eclipse did trigger something off, and I chose to apply consciousness because of my own personal journey and what I understand about what it is I need to integrate and become conscious of. So instead of reacting, I just replied with a very simple comment, and then I just closed that channel of interaction completely. That's a powerful example because A, it represents my Mars in the 12th. B, it represents my Mars being eclipsed, and the orb is quite wide, by the way, which is another example of when you are working with orbs and eclipses in relation to a conjunction or an opposition. Sometimes there are exceptions. Like, for example, the standard sort of orb I would use would be 8 degrees. But, in certain situations, it could be 10, 12 degrees and it could still be eclipsed, okay, which was the case in my situation. So Mars in the 12th, my Mars eclipsed, difficult male reacted in a particular way towards me. It wasn't pleasant. I must admit, it did actually upset me at the time. But I just decided to do what I needed to do about that situation, to grow from it and to not react and let it actually take my power away, because that's what Mars in the 12th means. It means that you have to reclaim your power. Just a side note, an important side note for those of you that might have Mars in the 12th. Now, look, the 12th house is hidden enemies, for those of you that don't know. So when you have planets in the 12th house, those planets describe your hidden enemies, whether you are aware of it or not. In most cases, you're not. We just aren't, because the 12th house is, everything's hidden in there, okay? And it's the house that really connects to the deepest sort of unconscious components of our being. So solar eclipse, as I said, comes up and it brings up things that are hidden. In this case, it brought up a situation that was somewhat hidden from my consciousness, but when I look back, my intuition knew something about this particular sort of individual, and the solar eclipse just highlighted, what I really needed to be aware of, and also it was a test for me of applying consciousnness and not reactive responses. Okay, it's very important because Mars can be a very reactive planet. Mars is the fist in your face type of archetype. It's the gun, all the violent sort of aggressive weapons that you can think of. That's Mars. Mars rules boxing, it rules fighting, it's all that stuff. So when Mars gets triggered, it can have a very strong reaction, right, to a situation where you may feel threatened, for instance. Anyway, that aside, just wanted to mention that because it's just a demonstration that with anything that comes up, because things come up all the time with our charts, right? We've got transits going on, we've got secondary progressions going on, we've got primary directions going on, we've got layers of things going on, and it can be very difficult to keep a track of that as well, by the way, which is, primarily the job of an astrologer anyway, to explain all that to you. But we are dealing with a lot, essentially, on a day-to-day basis. But it's not obviously as intense every single day. If it was, we'd all just be, we're all somewhat, mad, for lack of a better word, at times. But, we'd just be totally loopy, if we felt the intensity of everything on a daily basis. So there's a reason why planets move at the speed that they do, and there's a reason why certain cycles come up at certain junctures in life. None of that is accidental. It's the cosmic forces lining things up according to your soul's evolution and the perfect timing of what needs to show up for you, that your soul is ready to actually look at. So solar eclipse stuff, yeah, very, very intense. In my opinion, this solar eclipse is not easy, even though there's other opinions out there, because, look at this chart, which is, I would just need to adjust that a little bit to have it exact, because the exact is 10 degrees, right? It's not 12. It's the sun and the moon would be 10 degrees when that eclipse actually occurs. But you look at what's opposite, this eclipse. We're talking about South Node, Saturn, Pluto, all in Capricorn. This is not an easy little package over here on the other side. This is, this is really important, karmic, destined, fated lessons that are really about your consciousness, not only just from what you're aware of right now or what you've been working on in the last few months. This can pertain to past life stuff, many past lives. So it's very, very complex. But bottom line being that Saturn and Pluto is one of the most difficult conjunctions. I've said this before, I'll say it again. It's the deepest, deepest, deepest resistances that we have. And when we're dealing with a solar eclipse opposite, Saturn and Pluto, it's going to bring up some pretty hardcore lessons. It's going to bring up some pretty hardcore events that, it's not easy. And the more we resist, the more difficult it is. And also the opposition to the Saturn Pluto is just a way, in a positive, it's a way of something really coming, showing up for you, all right, that is so, because solar eclipse is things that are material, content that's kept out of your consciousness. So solar eclipse comes along, it triggers something, brings it into your consciousness, but through this energy of Saturn, Pluto, right? So it's really important growth stuff, basically, if you can work with this energy. Of course, it depends on who you are and what's going on in your life. So that's enough about that solar eclipse. As we move forward into the month, now we can see here that Mars has just ingressed into Leo. And Mercury is also ingressed into Leo just recently. And what will happen is, well, first of all, there's a conjunction happening here with Mars and Mercury, right? So, look, Mercury in Leo is a very opinionated Mercury, okay? So add Mars into the mix, it can be very aggressive, opinionated sort of thoughts or communications, right? To understand it from a personality level, right? I mean, Leo is very egocentric at a personality level. It's got so much pride, and it just thinks it's right. It's my opinion's right. Everyone has to hear my opinion. The whole world has to hear it because it's absolutely right. That's the kind of take that, to an extreme, the Leo energy can take. And I'm pointing this out because this Mars is going to form a square to Uranus as well. And that dynamic of Mars square, I'll unpack that in a moment. Just a little bit more about this Mercury, Mars, Leo. Just be very mindful that you too may be in a position where you feel very strong about, a particular opinion. And we can be so blindsided sometimes about our own opinion and perspective, and so fixed, all right, because Leo is a fixed sign. So it's fixed means it doesn't move, all right? It's not flexible. It's not fluid. It's completely fixed, literally fixed, all right? So when you have Mercury in Leo, Mars in Leo, there's a real fixed sort of attitude and opinionated, aggressive kind of communication or vocabulary that takes place. And look, in some cases, it might just very well be a good thing for some people. Maybe they need to speak up for themselves. So it is speaking from the heart as well, because Leo rules the heart, right? So, and we do need to speak from our heart. A lot of us don't. A lot of people don't know how to speak from their heart, are too scared, don't want to be rejected, all these sorts of things. So on a positive level, it can be speaking from your heart, but not not when it's at the cost of, I suppose, belittling other people or putting someone else down or anything like that. That's just ego personality battles. You know, that's not growth. That's not evolution. That's just lower astral behavior. And again, I know that sounds a bit judgmental, but I'm just distinguishing between, you know, personality-based living and more soul-orientated living. It doesn't mean, though, if you're, you know, more soul-orientated in your way of life, that you won't be challenged with these sorts of things. In fact, you may even get challenged a lot more, and you will notice it more than someone who's at the personality level. And that means that you've got more work to do on that particular component of yourself. Otherwise, this experience wouldn't be showing up. Whereas someone who's completely personality-based, they're not likely to really have that consciousness and that understanding to recognize a situation as a situation that can actually provide growth, right, or awareness or consciousness. It's just a competitive ego sort of space, if you like, when it comes to personality-based operation, right, when you're talking about Mars and Mercury in Leo. So very, very opinionated and very, very fixed in a particular mental perception. So just very important to watch that pretty much, you know, today, 3rd of July. Let's just animate this chart. As you can see, I've gone to the 4th of July and Mars is catching up to Mercury. I'm just going to animate it a little bit more. Or actually, just take note, Venus goes into Cancer on the 4th of July. But I will talk about Venus in a moment because I want to talk about her in her cycle of Cancer through the month of July. But just going back to Mars and Mercury in Leo. So as we progress the chart forward, now what happens is Mercury, you can see there it goes stationary, right? Well, it actually goes stationary 8th of July, stationary retrograde, that is, okay? So that's another subject unto itself. Leave that aside for a moment. So if we go forward, you can see that what's happening is that even though Mercury has gone stationary retrograde, this Mars-Mercury conjunction, look at that, it's exact, right? On the 9th of July. That day can be, you know, a bit challenging, I think, if people get really sort of, you know, on their high horse and, you know, become very sort of combative, you know, with their words. It can create a bit of conflict, to say the least. So I guess the thing to kind of consider with that is, you know, Mercury in Leo, as I said, it's your own personal opinions expressed very, very strongly, and it's very personal. And then you've got Mars right next to it, which adds a lot of fire, right, to a fire sign. And Mars, when operating at the personality level, it's just simply aggression, right, in the various and myriads of ways that aggression can come up, right, can manifest. So just be aware that day, you know, if there's a situation going on in your life that's a bit volatile and you know, on this particular day, especially if you're in a situation, whether it's work or with family, just be very aware that you can be sort of triggered quite easily with this Mars Mercury in Leo conjunction, and maybe say things that that down the track you might regret, right? It's important to really take note of that, and especially because Mercury is stationary retrograde, right? So you can't reverse it. And even though Mercury appears to be reversing, going retrograde, it's going to be very important what is communicated on this day, because then that Mercury going retrograde is going to take all that, whatever's been said, it's going to take it back into that retrograde period, which is for the month of July. And it can potentially create a lot more problems as you move through the month of July. So just be very aware of that. Look, on a positive, as I mentioned before, it's speaking from your heart. If it's got that authentic heart space content or expression, then that's a positive thing, and maybe that's something some of you out there might need to do. It might be a time where you can really just speak from your heart on a particular matter. But just be aware, because Mars Mercury is often aggressive communication. Okay, so a few days before that, Venus goes into Cancer, just over here on the 4th of July. And so she's left the sign of Gemini, which was quite a, very light-hearted social type of Venus. Perhaps there was more connections, networking and communication, sharing of knowledge and things going on over the last few weeks while Venus was in Gemini. Venus in Gemini is not a difficult sign at all. Not that Venus in Cancer is difficult, but it can be difficult because Venus in Cancer is an extremely sensitive Venus. She's in a water sign. It's the first water sign out of the 3. So it's not, Cancer hasn't emotionally matured. It's the first encounter of emotions, of feelings, of water. It's the first water sign. These things are important to pay attention to. So Venus in Cancer, she's very sensitive. She's very caring, very compassionate, very empathetic. And so for the month of July, this Venus in Cancer, she's really going to want to kind of nest up, just kind of be comfortable and take care of loved ones, and that includes friends as well. Could be family, or your own partner or lover. So there's a strong sort of urge to want to connect on that sensitive and caring level where you kind of really take care of each other. So that's the vibration that comes up very strongly with her, which is beautiful. And she will form a trine to Neptune later on in the month as well, which is a lovely aspect. But a day before or so, before she forms a trine to Neptune, she'll have an opposition to Saturn. And then a few days later, she'll have an opposition to Pluto. And I'll just give you those dates, actually. So Venus is opposite Saturn on the 17th of July. And she's opposite Pluto on the 21st of July. Those 2 days are not going to be easy days, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. It doesn't mean that it's going to be disastrous or it's, the end of your relationship or anything like that, although it can be for some people. But this transit, Venus opposite Saturn and Pluto alone would not indicate the end of a relationship. If that did happen to you, that would be because there are a number of different things going on in your own birth chart, okay? So an ending of a relationship it's a death. It's a pretty significant matter in a person's life, even though it may be for the best, which usually it is. It still will be reflected in various ways through your own chart. And this transit may just be a very strong trigger for underlying things that perhaps have been going on for some time. See, Saturn-Venus is often indicative of separation. It can be coming up against completely opposite sort of takes on the relationship, two people having two totally different perspectives on what the relationship is about, what it means. It can also bring about consolidation. It can also bring about discussing the relationship in more serious terms. So it has some good things about it, but ultimately it's usually separation or resistances, right? And it could just be that one or the other or both have certain resistances within the relationship that is basically highlighted during this transiting Venus opposite Saturn, which, as I said, takes place on the 17th of July and then opposite Pluto on the 21st of July. Now, the opposition to Pluto, that's not easy either. You know, that's at best and at the highest level, when if we're talking about the case of a relationship, then we're talking about at the highest level, two people, two individuals having the opportunity to really transform through something really important in their relationship. Transformation is not easy. Transformation does come with pain and suffering. So, Pluto's energy is, how can I put it? Pluto just wants to transform you all the time. That's Pluto's role. It's a soul, right? It's a soul evolving. So when it comes to Pluto highlighting a transformational experience, it's not going to be presented, with a box of chocolates and a bottle of wine. It's going to be presented with things that really trip you up, stir you up, evoke deep sort of fears or very strong reactions, confrontation, resistance. Those are the sorts of things that Pluto will bring up. But there is an opportunity there for some beautiful transformational work, and it could just be that you're in a relationship and you've been doing a lot of clearing, a lot of transformative work anyway. So this particular day with this opposition, Venus Pluto opposite each other, could just be a point where it's all of that's magnified, in a very powerful way. On a downside, though, it can be a literal ending of a relationship. Or complete power struggle, or a sense of disempowerment, one or the other, or whether it's both. It just depends on who you are, what's going on, what the relationship's about. But either way, with Venus opposite Saturn Pluto, there's some pretty important transformative resolutions that will show up, that will need to be looked at or attended to. Now, if you're not in a relationship, then, that energy is something that you will essentially be integrating into your own self. But because Venus rules friends as well, it can be things that come up in friendships too. So don't discount that as being a potential experience that shows up as well. Okay, so Mercury, just want to animate the chart forward. And what happens here is Mercury is stationary retrograde on the 8th of July. So Mercury is going to be retrograde until the end of the month. It goes direct on the 31st of July. So we're dealing with a month that has two eclipses. Mercury goes retrograde in the first week of this month. It forms a conjunction to Mars. We have Mars squaring Uranus. We have the solar and lunar eclipse. We have that beautiful little Venus in that extraordinarily sensitive place, being bombarded by Saturn and Pluto. Venus in Cancer, she just wants to take care of something or someone. And she equally wants to feel that same love and support and nurture. And she will be threatened by that Saturn-Pluto, because Saturn-Pluto are very hard energies. And Venus is not a hard energy or a hard archetype. Venus is about enjoyment and pleasure, right? It's about the sensual appetites in life. It's what you enjoy, when you're with a friend, or when you're with a lover, or when you're just listening to music or dancing, or it's the pleasures, the beautiful pleasures of life that we all have at different times. And in Cancer, she's so sensitive, and she comes around to oppose Saturn and Pluto. She's going to be very, very confronted. She's going to potentially become very withdrawn or self-protective, very defensive. Remember, Cancer is the archetype, the sign that it's such a subjective sign, meaning it it's not easily able to be objective about things, and this subjective nature is so dominated and triggered by this oversensitivity of this sign. So in Cancer, she's just going to want to protect herself. So it's like the crab that you see on the beach, right? Carries his little house on his back. And as that crab is kind of doing his sidewalk on the beach, the minute he senses some kind of threat, he just packs himself up, doesn't he? Packs himself up in his little house. Well, that's a very important metaphor to understand the nature of Cancer. That's what they're about. They're very protective, and they feel threatened quite easily as well. So they'll instinctively want to protect themselves. When you have Pluto and Saturn opposite Venus, she is threatened immediately. And that threat is going to bring up insecurities and lots of different issues going on for different people within their relationships. However, as I said, depending on who you are and the context of your relationship and the level of awareness you have, that will all determine how you deal with this transit, essentially. Mercury going retrograde, I don't need to really unpack Mercury retrograde. I'm fairly confident the majority of you understand the nature of Mercury retrograde, but it does sort of add things in the mix of this month, making things more testy, more sort of challenging, and that can create some, I suppose, some miscommunication, and or just troubled in communicating what you need to communicate, right? So we have the left brain mental faculty withdrawing, as it were, going back in, and so we're not able to really step forward with our ideas and our thinking and what we really want to communicate. There is a need to kind of take a step back with that. But that can be very difficult with Mars in Leo that just wants to push forward and push out. And then Mars will form a square to Uranus, and I just want to show you the date of that. So you can see here on the 10th of July that Mars is at 5 degrees of Leo, and Uranus is 6 degrees of Taurus. This is called an applying square. Applying just simply means that Mars is applying to form a square to Uranus. The applying aspect is always the most potent. So this lead up, in other words, this particular day here, the energy will start really kind of brewing up, okay? So this day here and the subsequent day, so the 10th, 11th, and 12th of July, those 3 days, we have Mars pretty much square Uranus. And if we go to the following day, 13th, so yes, I would include all those days, okay, starting from, what was it, the 10th? Let me just go back. Yes, starting from the 10th, just make sure. Yeah, I would start from about the 10th, being aware of this particular dynamic, and I'll tell you what it does and what it's about in a minute. So 10th to 13th, so 3 days, okay, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not in one way, but it only takes a split second for something unpredictable or dangerous to happen, right? So I use those words very deliberately because a Mars square Uranus is an incredibly frustrating dynamic. It's internal conflict for one. It's a sense of wanting, Mars is wanting to do his own thing, and Uranus is wanting to do his own thing, and they're just both in conflict with each other essentially. But it can be unpredictable behavior and action that somebody takes, really sort of reckless kind of action, right? So when it comes to driving and, handling things that require things that, if you're handling machinery, stuff like that, for instance, I think you need to be very careful on those 3 days. If you're driving, you need to be very careful on those 3 days. Not necessarily every single on the planet has to be careful on those 3 days, but if there are things, sort of lying dormant for you that are frustrations, right? Your own inner frustrations. We all have them. No one's, no one on this planet doesn't have different frustrations at different times in their life. Well, they wouldn't be human if they didn't. And I haven't met anybody who's not human on this planet. I've seen spirits and things like that, but that's a whole other conversation. But if you are human and you are here and you are in this physical body, you will endure and encounter different frustrations in life that will be mirrored through different ways. A Mars square Uranus is an extreme frustration of wanting to basically do your Mars thing, do your own thing, take direction, right? And the Uranus adds a real unpredictable sort of element to the mix as well. Those two planets can be very, very powerful, but very, very dangerous because it can be extremely reckless behavior. And as I said, if you've got some things going on within your own self, some frustrations, those 3 days will be very sort of sensitive for you, if you like, because that energy will trigger these sort of suppressed frustrations, if you like. And that can create behaving in certain ways that's reckless, which ultimately can be dangerous. So I think it's good to be aware of that, those 3 days, and because you may be triggered. And if you know this, then you might at least have this in mind and just take note and perhaps take a different course of action or make a different decision, right? At best, that's all we can do. But it's a very frustrating sort of dynamic and aspect that can, cause a lot of reckless behavior to take place that can lead to aggression and so forth as well. So just very important to watch that one on those few days. Moving forward, let me just see. So 16th of July, we have the full moon eclipse. It's a partial full moon eclipse. I have done a video on this, so I'm not going to unpack this now, but just very important to note that the eclipse takes place on the 16th of July. Now, this is not exact here. I would need to adjust that by a couple of hours to get that exactly opposite the sun, which would be at 24 degrees of Cancer, right? So we'd have the sun at 24 and we would have the moon at 24 Capricorn, and that's the lunar eclipse. And the nodes are hovering near the sun and the moon, which is what creates an eclipse. Now, as I said, I'm not going to unpack this eclipse because I've already done that, so please watch that video if you haven't. But just being mindful that these days leading up to this full moon eclipse, very sensitive, volatile energy, vibration, a lot of emotional stuff getting triggered, all right? It's not an easy eclipse either because the moon is conjunct Pluto, South Node and Saturn, and they're all opposite the sun. So we've got a heavy dose this month of Saturn, Pluto, South Node connecting to both the solar and lunar eclipses, which is telling me very strongly that whatever it is that we need to deal with this month, or that shows up for us, is going to require patience, stamina, determination, and maybe a bit of pain as well. So it's not going to be easy. This month is a real doozy, in my opinion. There's just quite a few difficult things going on. Also, we have, Pluto's retrograde, Saturn's retrograde, Mercury's retrograde, Jupiter is retrograde, Ceres is retrograde. And I just want to take you back because I want to show you that Chiron, if we go back to the 8th of July, Chiron recently went into Aries. Chiron has a very long journey in Aries. And Chiron goes stationary, retrograde. Well, it begins actually on the 9th of July and is retrograde by the 11th of July. So here's another major player in the chart, in our own chart, and in this chart, and in terms of the collective influence of what this does and has. And I've done a video on Chiron in Aries, so I don't want to unpack that either, but I just wanted to bring to your attention that Chiron does go retrograde. It hasn't been retrograde for a while, and it goes retrograde on the 11th of July, and it will stay retrograde until the end of the year, until the 15th of December to be precise. So we're talking about Chiron being retrograde for 6 months, right, for the rest of this year. That's very, very significant. And clearly that ties into wherever Chiron is transiting in your own chart and the healing work that you are perhaps working on, and any issues that come up for you with Chiron transiting Aries and wherever Aries is in your chart, which will have to do with a lot of your own personal sense of self and identity, and rejection issues around that actually would be very prominent. But there's going to be a massive shift with Chiron going retrograde, and I do want to speak on that more, but perhaps not today, because I just want to wrap this video up. So moving on back to the 16th, which is when we have the lunar eclipse. On the 16th, no, it's it's around about from the 15th to, yeah, okay. So about the 15th and 16th of July, see here this red arrow, that's Vulcan. Vulcan will be conjunct Venus. Now, this is a powerful conjunction in my opinion. Vulcan, for those of you that don't know, is always traveling very close to the sun. If you look at any transits, if you look at your own birth chart, you'll see that Vulcan is not very far away from your sun. It's always there for everybody. So when I notice Vulcan forming a conjunction to any other planet other than the sun, I pay very close attention to that, because it doesn't do it all the time. And especially in your own chart natally, if you have Vulcan on an angle, then Vulcan is a big player in your life, and it has a very big story to tell about you and your life and what you're doing here. But just very briefly, Vulcan being conjunct Venus in Cancer is alchemical work in our relationships. If you're not in a relationship, it's the alchemical work that you can do on your own self, right? And more specifically, your self-worth and your inner intrinsic value system. Alchemical work is very, very powerful, and one might have different interpretations of what that means. But in my understanding, especially when we're talking about Vulcan, he was a blacksmith, to put it very simply, but he was an alchemist essentially. And when it comes to Vulcan work, again, it's difficult work, it's challenging work, and it really calls on those components within you that really do want to work very deeply on a particular matter, right? That takes time as well. It's, nothing as deep as this is healed or resolved overnight. But I think what's happening here is, over those couple of days, there is an opportunity to work with Vulcan's energy on that alchemical level. And if you are the sort of person that is, very interested in transformational work, personal development, healing work, healing the inner feminine, the inner masculine, working with guides, working with angels, working with your higher self, these are all things, practices that anyone can do, and you can do them on a daily basis, you can do them on a weekly basis. It's a personal journey. Point being, though, that if you are operating on those streams, you can tune into these vibrations in different ways. And by tuning into this Vulcan Venus, you have an opportunity for a couple of days before she gets to that opposite Saturn Pluto stuff to maybe work through something that's actually that you've already been working on, but that there could be an ability to go into a deeper space with what you've already been working on. Okay, that's probably the most simple way I can put it. Okay, so moving on. Well, if we want to unpack things a little bit further, we have the Sun opposite Pluto on the 14th of July. That's a very powerful aspect. Very, very powerful. I think that can be a very self-empowering aspect, our own ability to tune into greater ability for our own personal transformation. That's at best, obviously. And again, that will really connect to it'll connect to certain aspects of your life, things that maybe you've been working on already, or it could just be that it triggers something very important within you, on this day, that you feel such an intensity about this particular issue that comes up for you, and the deep desire to really want to do some powerful work around that. So it can be a trigger on that level as well. But I mean, on a high note, it's, self-empowerment, transformation, regeneration. Pluto is always about regeneration. Never forget that. I know it's a similar word to transformation, but it's also a bit different. Pluto is how we reinvent ourselves, So when you see somebody, somebody in the media, in the famous sort of stream of things, and let's just say it was an artist, and to be even more specific, let's just say it was a singer, and they had a career for 10, 15 years or less, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then they vanish, right? That's Pluto. When they disappear, that's Pluto, right? Going into the underworld. And then they come back, it could be 1 year later, it could be 10 years later, it could be 20 years later, right? They have this re-emergence. It's a reinvention of themselves. Well, that whole thing I just described is basically ruled by Pluto, that whole entire experience. And it's a good example because you can see how that can be translated or transferred into just your own life and your journey and what it is that you are. Perhaps you might be at a point where you are reinventing something about your own self, about your own journey. It could be about your creativity. It could be about your career. It could be about your relationships. It could be any one of those things. But the point is that it's a vibration that enables us to reinvent ourselves. So never underestimate the power of Pluto. So that's that aspect on that day. Let me see if there's anything else that I want to just quickly mention. So Mercury moves direct on the 31st of July. I'll just show you that just quickly. Oops. Okie dokie. So, well, in Australia, because this chart is done for Australia, so in Australia it hasn't actually gone direct on that day, but for those of you on the other side of the world, it will on the 31st. For us, it doesn't go stationary direct until the 1st of August. So that's always going to be a point of difference in dates with the southern and northern hemispheres. And then, let's just see. It's actually on the 1st of August or the 31st of July, depending on, where you are on the planet. We have this beautiful new moon in Leo, but I won't talk about that now because that's really moving into the month of August, and that's starting off our month for August, which is great. But let's not just try not to get too ahead of ourselves, because I think we really need to be very conscious and mindful and aware of the energies of the month of July, because predominantly they're not easy. I'd just like to just grab something. Just bear with me. I just want to quickly look something up. Where are we? Just going back to that Mars square Uranus, which was earlier in the month. Let's just take it back, right back to around about here. And as I said, we could even go a day before that. It could even start from the 10th of July. So those 3 days, I really just want to emphasize that that energy can be very disruptive, right? And disruptive not necessarily in a good way, okay? Because it's Mars, right? And Mars out of control can be very, very dangerous. But it does bring up our own kind of, if you're feeling really restless in your life, if there's something that you are just really, really restless about, this energy is going to amp that up. It's going to amp up being a lot more impulsive, which goes back to what I said earlier about being reckless and acting in ways that you normally wouldn't. Now, I do want to say this, though, because I didn't say it and I think it's important. On a positive, it can be that you have a breakthrough of some kind that can make you feel more in touch with the Mars masculine sort of principle or energy, and maybe that's important for you at this time in your life. But even though it can be a breakthrough type energy, because it's Mars, it does have that edge to it that can bring danger. So just be very mindful of reckless, impulsive type of behavior. The other matter that comes into this is people who really rub you up the wrong way, and people who you feel restrain you or restrain your life in any kind of way. Authority figures that, are real Saturnian types. If you're around that kind of thing those days, that's going to have a very strong sort of trigger and reactive sort of response in you if you've got these underlying sort of restless issues going on or frustrations, okay? Because Mars he just wants to direct himself and be free with that Uranus energy, but there can be source of frustration through what appears to be people or circumstances that try to limit you in that way, which makes that Mars even more aggressive and makes that Uranus even more unpredictable, right? It brings up the rebel sort of behavior, right? Which I don't have anything against rebellious behavior. In fact, I'm all for it, really. If it's purposeful and if it creates important change, for the collective or for a community or for an individual, then it's necessary. But rebellion that has some kind of purpose, that's not just destructive for the sake of being destructive, right? So it does bring up that rebellious kind of streak in nature. If you have felt that you haven't been able to express, your Mars in your own, and not only just Mars but Uranus, if you felt that you've it's been difficult for you to express your own individual will, then this energy is going to provoke those issues. There's underlying things going on, so these issues will be triggered, right? And it's an experience where one feels they really need to assert themselves and their power and their ego, as it were, right? And in healthy situations, that's fine, but that you can imagine, right? Personality based type of individual operating from that level, how explosive and dangerous this energy can be. In the wrong hands, this can be very destructive, is what I'm trying to say. And just to add one final note to this Mars Uranus aspect, aside from the points on danger, impulsiveness, and acting out, and things like that, it can also produce a sense of liberation, perhaps for an individual who has really been struggling to express their own individuality and ability to be free, right? To be free for um, free in their own life in some kind of way, to feel that sense of exhilaration and freedom, right? To express their own individuality. This particular aspect can be very empowering on that level, but I think the key component is about having some awareness with it and not just impulsively acting out on anything that kind of appears to block you or piss you off. Um, okay, now I think that's pretty much it, and I think that's enough really to give us an insight into the month of July, which you can see has some challenging aspects to it. You know, we do have also the Sun opposite Saturn on the 10th of July, so a few days before the Sun being opposite Pluto. And the Sun opposite Saturn can very easily be blocks or frustrations on this particular day. You may feel that the opposing forces that you are dealing with in your life are really blocking your path. So if you do, don't stress, don't worry about it. It's just one day. So if something does get triggered on that level, don't let it become bigger than what it actually is, because the beauty of transits, especially fast moving transits, is that they don't last long, so we can work with these energies. It might just be that if you wake up and you are feeling really intense because of that Mars Uranus sort of vibration, and you're feeling a bit crazy or a bit on edge or a bit reckless or whatever, then you might not go to work that day, or you might not do your normal routine. You might just opt for a different sort of thing. I'd recommend going for a run, going to the gym, going and hit a boxing bag, whatever. Let that energy be. Give it a channel, but give it a channel that's not going to hurt you or anybody else. In the same case, when you have the Sun opposite Saturn, yeah, that day might be really frustrating because opposing forces are trying to block your path or limit you in some kind of way, but that's just one day. That doesn't cover or color your journey, your whole journey moving forward. So we kind of need to put things into perspective, right? So whilst it is a challenging month, and it is, there's a lot of things going on, as I've explained, we will all survive it, but we just do need to be aware of these dates and these days where these things come up that can create a challenge. Is fine, but if you've got numerous things going on in your life, then the triggers of these types of transits can really make things a lot worse, which is why it's useful to be aware of the upcoming month and what essentially we're going to be dealing with on this cosmic level, right? Okay, I think I'll definitely leave it there because I've gone probably over the time that I initially wanted to. Just checking to see if I've left anything out. I don't believe I have. Okay, guys, well, sending you guys lots of love and blessings and lots of inner strength, always remember to tune back into yourself, your own inner resources, your own insight, and understanding about your own self as well. No one knows you better than you. So never underestimate the power of your own soul. power of your own intuition and the power of your own will, right? These sorts of readings can be a guidance point, you know, can be supportive, but at the end of the day, whatever happens is going to come down to the action that you take and the consciousness that you have, right? So always keep that in mind. Thanks again for listening, guys, and feel free again to write your comments or questions below. I always do my best to answer all of them. Please keep them relative to um, the topic of what I've discussed today, and please don't make them essay-long questions. It's just becoming very difficult for me to respond to those really long sorts of questions. So if you can just please respect that, that would be great. And I'll see you guys next time. I will see you. I will do a video. But in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and see you guys soon. Bye.